The day is cooling down at 88 degrees Fahrenheit, and I am ready for spooky season. Hello, friends and enemies. Welcome to Horror and Inconvenience, where things are usually spooky and always weird. And welcome to my good riddance to summer reading wrap-up. To your hell. Well, this is my third seasonal wrap-up so far, so I think by now you're starting to get the idea. I've divided the year into 4 sets of 3 months each, so that I do not have to do a monthly reading wrap-up, because I am bad at that level of commitment. So these videos have a tendency to get very long, and my friends and family are starting to make fun of me for the length of my videos. So I'm going to try to keep this at a fairly fast clip and not to talk too much about books that I've talked about in other videos. We'll see how it goes. So June was Pride Month, and I did a special Pride TBR and also a Pride reading wrap-up at the end of the month. So I've already done mini reviews of most of the books that I read in that month. I just want to give shout-outs to the 3 books that I covered in that wrap-up that really stuck with me, which were Fitzharris' latest, Happy-Go-Lucky. The man's a genius. A very, very mean little genius. Manhunt by Gretchen Felker Martin, which has made TERFs so angry, and queer gorehounds so happy. Well, happy's sad, but like satisfied with the sadness, like it was really meaty, compelling sadness. I probably shouldn't use the word meaty to refer to... Anyway. And the third would be Wrath Goddess Sing by Maya Dean, which somehow made the Iliad queerer. 5 stars. I don't do starred reviews, but if I did, it would get those. Okay, so I did read 2 things in June that I didn't cover in the Pride reading wrap-up because they were not strictly queer, and I read them for other reasons. And they were both huge winners. So, let's talk about Lapvona by Ottessa Moshfegh. This is an author I really admire. She's most famous for My Year of Rest and Relaxation. This is her new book that came out in June, so I immediately purchased it, of course. At the time I was reading it, when my coworkers who were also fans asked me how it compared to her other works, I said I put it on par with My Year of Rest and Relaxation, which was pretty high praise from me. But since I've had time to think about this book after putting it down, and I think I've thought about it every day since I put it down, I would say this has probably become my favorite of hers. Now, I've kind of dipped around in her other works. I've only completed reading 2 of her novels, and I'm working on something about mood reading and half-read books, so we'll discuss that in the future. But Lapvona is a kind of twisted fable set in a medieval village. It's all about isolation and incest. I mean it in the metaphorical sense, although I think some literal incest happens in it. I mean, like, as a theme, the concept of incestuous bonds, and just perversion. I won't say of the natural order, because the characters, in their very isolated and particular worldview, tend to think of these things as the natural order. a lot of really disgusting stuff happens in this book. There's a light sprinkling of fairy tale style magic, and I mean gruesome fairy tale style magic in it, but it's really not the center of the book. It happens almost as a matter of course, as an extension of the character's worldview. I found it shocking and page-turning and utterly compelling, and I want to hear what others may have thought of it in the comments or anywhere else you can get a hold of me. Yeah, still thinking about this all the time. The other extra book I read in June was the first volume of Shibuya Goldfish, which is a manga about giant carnivorous goldfish overtaking the Shibuya district of Tokyo. No notes. July was a good reading month for me, partly because it was the month of my 30th birthday and I felt inclined towards self-indulgence, which meant often picking books I was looking forward to and therefore read faster. Also, because I got COVID in July and was stuck at home and half bedridden for about 5 days with nothing to do but read. So, thanks, plague. As usual, I'm going to go over these more or less in the order I read them, because the ranking of books causes me stress and bothers me and makes me worry going forward whether I really ranked things right. And it's deeply subjective. So, and in fact, sometimes I've watched YouTube reviews of books before picking them up, and other people's starred ratings have had undue influence on my decision whether to read books that I later found out were much better or much worse than I expected based on them. I just don't think that's super helpful in a conversation. This might be grad school brain rot, I don't know. But that's how I am, that's what we're doing. So, first thing I finished in July was You've Lost a Lot of Blood by Eric LaRocca. I did not like Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke at all. It was very bad. This was actually pretty good, though. It's a little heftier, and there's room for a little bit more development. It's still a very surface level book in some ways. It skips around a lot. There's a lot of text within a text, which sort of takes away from certain elements of character development. For example, including a character's in-world writing might deepen that character in some ways, but it still sidelines that character's relationship with the other characters, that sort of thing. So the sort of outer plot suffered for this, but I'll be honest, I think text within a text and multimedia storytelling are so much fun. It's a gimmick that works on me. So I enjoyed it for the sheer discovery, the sheer surprise of it. No, I haven't read House of Leaves yet. Shut up, I'm working on it. But I had a lot of fun. Ultimately, I don't think this really moved me all that deeply or is really going to stick with me all that much, but I really did have a good experience reading it. I'm going to put the cover of this next one up because I read it as an audiobook. I mention this frequently, but most of the audiobooks I read are nonfiction, and I read a huge chunk of my nonfiction in the audio format. But this was The Facemaker by Lindsey Fitzharris, who I've been a fan of for a number of years. When my friend Jude first got me into Ask a Mortician and the wider world of Caitlin Doty's writing, I followed her, guests on her show, one of whom was Lindsey Fitzharris, who very briefly had a YouTube channel talking about the history of medicine. So when she came out with her first book, which was a biography of Joseph Lister called The Butchering Art, which I highly recommend, an excellent read, I was all over it. So The Facemaker is her latest, and it's about a surgeon who pioneered reconstructive facial surgery during World War One. I love reading about historical surgical techniques. There's a reason I'm in this seedy corner of YouTube with you freaks, and it's because history of medicine is my jam. I love the history of medical discoveries, the mixture of wonder at what humans can do for one another and horror at the pain they'll cause one another to achieve those ends. Really is. I mean, it's what you seek a lot of times in horror fiction, right? It's that apotheosis of awe and terror. It works for me. It's fascinating. This book was a little more positive, a little lighter than the kind of history of medicine stuff I usually read, although since it's set during World War One, which is objectively one of the most horrible things that happened, you know, put it up there with lots of other wars. Wars are bad. We don't rank wars here. It's a bad thing that happened, and humans shouldn't have done it and shouldn't do it again, is my point. So there was a lot of horror in it, but, you know, this is about a man whose brilliance and tenacity led to the improvement of the lives of a lot of soldiers who were facing both physical disability and social ostracism for facial disfigurements that they got in the war. So ultimately, a pretty moving and uplifting story at its core. Lindsey Fitzharris is a very strong writer. Her research is solid and her details are accurate, but she tells a fast-paced, thrilling story. And you know what? There are a lot of nonfiction books out there in the world. I reserve the right to require both. She delivers. I finally got around to reading Comfort Me with Apples by Catherynne M. Valente, which is, despite really liking Catherynne M. Valente, I read The Girl Who Circumnavigated Fairyland back when it was available for free online as a regularly updated website. I was on the fence about this one because it's a novella and it has a twist, so nobody would describe to me what it was actually about. I think it's fun if I don't give the twist away. I don't normally care for twists, but this one was earned and not a huge shock by the time it came around. It felt inevitable, which is how I like them. But it has a Stepford Wives element, and it has an element of a feminist mythological retelling. And if that's not enough to grab you, I can't help you. I really enjoyed this, and you will too. I finally read Rosemary's Baby, but I'm not going to talk about it because it was for a very exciting upcoming video, and you'll see it when you see it. It's going to be fun. I will say I liked it a lot, though. Okay, I'm holding up the Blu-ray case for this because the book itself is upstairs in my mother's library, and I did not feel like going to grab it. But I read Election by Tom Perrota, which is the basis of a movie I've always really liked. And when I say always, my parents showed me this when I was like 13. It was not appropriate. I loved it. I still love it. The book is a little darker, a little harsher, and I really enjoyed it. I read it at the height of like my COVID delirium, and I was just totally swept away by it. If you don't know, Election is a satirical story of two candidates in a high school presidential election and the teacher who gets far too involved, to everybody's downfall. The anti-heroine is Tracy Flick, a 16-year-old, 17-year-old girl who is running for class president. She's an overachiever. She deserves the job. But the teacher has an axe to grind with her because his best friend at the school was a teacher who sexually abused her, and he blames her for that teacher being fired. What a ride. I think, honestly, as much as I like this movie and really admire Reese Witherspoon's early performance in it, book's better. Sorry, but it is. The sequel just came out. It's called Tracy Flick Can't Win, and it follows Tracy Flick's adventures as an adult when she becomes a high school principal herself. I haven't finished it yet. I'm working my way through it as the mood strikes me, but it's great so far. In July, I also got a hold of No'u Revilla's Ask the Brindled, which those who saw my Hawaii video might remember I was really looking forward to, having read some of her poetry online. I grabbed it as an electronic ARC. I don't like to read electronic books. I have trouble concentrating on them. But that's not the case with this one. It's good poetry. She's a good poet, and it's not a surprise that it won an award far in advance of its publication. It's a good book. There's a lot of variety of form. There's a lot of use of historical and religious and mythological imagery in a way that really draws you in, but still feels very urgent. It's a very good book. I bought this book as a birthday present to myself. It's called Patricia Wants to Cuddle. And it's about a Bachelor-like reality show where the contestants are spending a weekend in the Pacific Northwest for one of the final seasons and are massacred by lesbian Sasquatch. It does precisely what it says on the tin. Because this straddles the line between regular fiction and horror, it's actually shelved in the general fiction section. It didn't have quite the amount of dread and gore that I would have loved, but the ending was solid. Definitely worth a read. Plus, look at that cover design. Another nonfiction audiobook was Doing Harm by Maya Dusenbery. It's about how medicine discriminates against women, and it's hard for complaints that mostly affect women, especially chronic ones, to be diagnosed and treated and taken seriously. So that hit very close to home. It was super sad. If you're not familiar with this issue, I'm begging you to read it because it's exhausting to explain it. I really enjoyed this one. It's probably the weirdest of the bunch I'm talking about in this video. And that's The Tiger Flu by Larissa Lai. Came out several years ago, maybe in 2018, before the pandemic. And it sounds, on the face of its description, like another post-apocalyptic pandemic novel, but that doesn't capture the tone of this book at all. What this really is a surreal biopunk fable. If you enjoy cyberpunk, if you enjoy utopian and dystopian women's fiction, if you enjoy really most kinds of kind of avant-garde sci-fi, you'll probably enjoy this. It takes place in the far future, and one of the main characters grows up in a society of all-female clones, and the way that they reproduce via doublers, people who essentially randomly get pregnant with litters of clone babies. to repopulate their all-clone village. And they keep these people healthy via starfish, who are people who, if you cut off a part of their body, it will regrow. And the grooms, who do surgery to remove parts from the starfish, bring them to the doublers, and provide aftercare for both. So one of the main characters is a groom. If you want to see some of the trippiest, weirdest, and occasionally most erotic descriptions of surgery that you've ever experienced, look no further. But that barely scratches the surface of the kind of weird, fecund, inventive sci-fi that this is. And it's all very lyrically written. Lai is a very capable and poetic writer. I recommend this. It's very hard to describe. I could probably sit here for an hour trying to describe it to you, and you would still be surprised when you read it. Finally, in July, I read Light from Uncommon Stars by Ryka Aoki. This is, to put it very simply, a book that, while less farcical than either, in its premise sort of combines the vibes of Good Omens and Hitchhiker's Guide. It's not quite that funny, it's more cozy, but it is about a violinist who owes her soul to the devil, falling in love with an alien ship's captain on the run from a galactic empire. Who runs a donut shop. So, sci-fi meets fantasy meets fan fiction, and everybody's queer. We all win. Okay, August was a bit of a rough month for me. Several of the titles I read were for Garbogust, and then I panicked about Garbogust and had a little reading slump. So we're just gonna talk through this as best we can. First thing I finished in August was Flowers in the Attic, which I discussed in the video I just posted. I then read John Cleland's Fanny Hill, which I also reviewed in a video that I way overdid and don't regret. So then one night I was sitting there thinking about the absolute garbage I had just consumed for like a week straight. And I decided, you know what? I'm just going to sit here and read a brief piece of literary fiction. So I picked up what I'd found at a book sale, The Strange Case of Rachel K. by Rachel Kushner, which is a very short compilation of 3 short stories. I just saw this and thought it looked interesting. And it was interesting. These are literary short stories. If you like that kind of thing, you might find them refreshing. But I don't have a ton to say about them. I wanted, after the previous 2 books I'd read, to reacquaint myself with the concept of an author thinking about the words they use. So this was nice and refreshing, and aperitif, if you will. Okay, so Criminali's group read for Garbogust was Go Ask Alice by Anonymous, but it's really by Beatrice Sparks. So I went ahead and picked this up and read it with everybody else. I had never read it as a teenager because even though I have never been immune to trash, I did read several Ellen Hopkins books. This just wasn't as much in the discourse at the time, and I never really saw the appeal. I've now, having read it, I still don't see the appeal. So I found myself, when I put this book down, curious as to how it could possibly have ever gotten popular enough to create a 50th anniversary edition. So I naturally picked up the recent true crime book, Unmask Alice, which talks about the fraud behind the story and other books by the anonymous author whose name was Beatrice Sparks. It is a wild story. Really, really upsetting at times. Because the thing with stories of fraud, for me, they can sometimes almost be more upsetting than stories of gore because there's so much about manipulation and emotional abuse and, social and class-based abuse as well. And there was a lot of that in this story. Beatrice Sparks manipulated and took advantage of just about everybody she came into contact with, as far as I am aware from this author's research. I read this as an audiobook, though, and I found myself listening to it. At times I normally wouldn't listen to audiobooks, just sitting there and soaking in the story. I definitely think it's a worthwhile read. It's hard. Another reason I don't like true crime, it's hard when so many of the involved people are still alive to really judge the quality of someone's research. So it's hard to know exactly what to believe, but that said, I do believe the general story. There is plenty of evidence that Beatrice Sparks was a grifter and that she hurt a lot of people. And then there's the evidence within Go Ask Alice itself, which to a modern reader is a self-evident fraud. I don't think Go Ask Alice really dives deeply enough into how and why this affected so many people and so many believed it, but it did give me a little insight into that. I'm still a little lost, though. If you have anything to add, I'd love to hear it. I am not immune to YA fiction. I read All of Us Villains because it came out in paperback this month. I still can't decide if I liked it. I'm currently reading the sequel that just came out, and I'm still deciding. But once I finish the duology, I will probably make a video discussing my reaction, which I suspect is going to be poor, but I don't know that for sure. It has me hooked on the plot, even though I don't really like any of the characters and suspect that I'm not going to love how it ends either. I'm in it. So I guess they did something right. An outstanding read that I just finished on audio, and in this case, it was on audio because the physical copy is back-ordered until further notice, is Jennette McCurdy's memoir, I'm Glad My Mom Died. Jennette McCurdy was one of the stars on iCarly, which came out when I was just starting to age out of those kinds of shows. It was a live-action Nickelodeon show, and I was in high school. But I did, for a while during that time, live with my younger cousins, so I did watch several of the early episodes with them, and then I watched the whole Quentin Reviews series on the Nickelodeon Cinematic Universe. So I'm up to speed, and McCurdy's memoir, that Nickelodeon tried to pay her off not to write, deals with the difficulties of being a child star and the abuses suffered at the hands of the network, while also being a very well-written and reflective memoir about childhood abuse she suffered at the hands of her narcissistic stage mom. I'm not really, and I say this every time I read a memoir, so it's obviously been proven wrong in a lot of cases, but I don't think of myself as a fan of memoir as a genre. But a strong writer can make a real-life story very compelling, especially if it's a story that has a lot of cultural weight, such as a story about a massive industry that produces a lot of money and a lot of our culture and systematically abuses and allows abuses against children. I think it's worth a read. It's a hard read. Trigger warning for everything, but worthwhile. So the only other book I have to talk about in this video, aside from A Spell for Chameleon, which I discussed in the video I just posted, it was a reread for me, is Reluctant Immortals by Gwendolyn Kist. This was a lot of fun. The premise is that Lucy Westenra from Dracula doesn't actually die, she becomes a vampire. And her best friend is Bertha Mason from Jane Eyre. Because Rochester is possessed by the restless spirit of the tenants his family had been abusing for hundreds of years. And subjects both Bertha and Jane Eyre to this possession so that they are all unhappily immortal. Lucy and Bertha end up forced onto a quest to eliminate both Dracula and Rochester as Dracula begins to return from the dead. Renfield appears. There's a nice little side love story between Bertha and Jane, and it all takes place in 1960s California, with a huge chunk of the plot taking place in the Haight during the Summer of Love. It was a good time. It wasn't particularly deep. It did not change my perception of the original material it adapts, although I did really like this particularly sympathetic portrayal of Renfield. Renfield's a really interesting character. Maybe it's just because Tom Waits played him in the best movie. But yeah, this was a really fun read, and this just came out straight to paperback in true horror fiction tradition, and I think it's fun. If you like the books it's based on, or even if you haven't read them but are interested in the way people mix up cultural artifacts and retell stories like this, retell myths, I think it's a fun ride to pick up and you should try it. Okay, that wraps up my summer reading, totaling at 31 books, which averages a really strong July with a fairly poor August for me, keeping me at my general clip of about 10 books a month, which feels good to me because I want to try to conquer the passage of time by reading infinite books during my finite life. I need to take a Xanax, so I'm gonna go ahead and end this. Lots of good stuff coming up this fall. Hopefully I've got some projects in the works, assuming I don't get COVID again, or get sick some other way, or have a depression spiral, or whatever. I don't think my Halloween party planning should be too disruptive at this stage. We'll revisit that in October. Anyway, thanks for watching, and ghoul health to you.